Hello. So this is part one of a two-part lecture series on geography, inequality, and politics. And what we're going to do is examine how the distribution of people by density, by race, by class, urban, rural, etc., influences political attitudes and voting. So let's begin by noting that since 1950, and really before then, the long term trend is for more and more Americans to move to the cities. Um, and so you can see here that the percentage of the population just divided into urban and rural, setting aside suburban for the moment. The proportion of the population, American population, that lives in urban areas has grown significantly um, in the last 70 years or so, and is going to continue to grow. Now, this um, this is part of a longer term, a larger trend in which people have begun to sort themselves out in ways that really have led to greater um, geographic distinctions between Republicans and Democrats. And so we can see a kind of sorting, a kind of people tending to cluster together according to certain attributes. That sorting is based upon four main factors: partisanship, uh, Republican, Democrat, minority status by race or ethnicity, um, personality traits of individuals, and then education levels. And we can learn so much by American politics by understanding how this sorting process, placing people into more homogenous groupings geographically, has impacted our, uh, our voting and other things. The big picture is that the sorting of the last 30 years or so has left behind a more politically and culturally homogenous rural population that has become more and more Republican, and this is where the Donald Trump has gained the bulk of his support. So let's start by looking at how the sorting process is taking place by party. So this chart shows us it looks at counties in the United States, and it divides them up according to population density and their propensity to vote for the Democratic Party in presidential elections. And then it shows us three snapshots in time. You can see that in 1916, um, with population, over to the left side of the lower axis is the low population counties, and there are more of them. And then on the far right are the highest density counties. And you can see that in 1916, there were many more low density counties than there were high density counties. And you can also see that the share of the presidential vote going to the Democratic Party was pretty much the same, regardless of whether people lived in rural areas or low density uh, counties or high density counties. It was right there, pretty steady, just below 50%. Fast forward to 1960, and you begin to see some trend here that the the higher density population density counties voted more Democratic than the low density counties. And then in 2016 is where the differences become quite dramatic. Population density is a strong predictor of partisanship. Um, those who live in high density urban areas were very likely to vote Democratic. Those who lived in low-density rural areas, very likely to vote Republican. So this is not a trend. This is not a relationship that's always existed. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. This shows the county level data on voting for presidential elections in 1976. And basically, there are three things we can notice here. First of all, the dark shaded counties are those that were landslides in favor of the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter. And those that are gray colored were landslides in favor of Gerald Ford, the Republican candidate. And by landslides, we mean that the vote was lopsided by 20% or more in favor of the top the top candidate. Now, the white counties are those where the election was more competitive. So the winner got less than 20% more than the loser. So several things. First of all, notice that most counties in the United States, and they're spread across the country, were white, which means that those counties were fairly competitive. Neither party had an overwhelming advantage. Notice that where the Republicans did have a big advantage of the Democrats, the gray counties, that was mainly in the plain states and the Rocky Mountain states. And where the Democrats had a big advantage was actually in the South. This was the last election really where the Democrats had that kind of power in Southern politics. With Ronald Reagan, the South shifted decisively in favor of the Republican Party. Now, Jimmy Carter from Georgia had some credibility in the South that other candidates might not have had. He was kind of a regional candidate in some ways. But notice here that we don't see a lot of sorting by partisanship. This is 2004, after what's called the Great Sort. So here, first of all, we notice there are many, many fewer competitive counties. The white counties are mainly in the upper Midwest. That remains a competitive battleground. In the New England area, somewhat in the Southwest. But most of the country is not competitive. Notice that there's an enormous number of counties in low-density states, population states, that now are solidly Republican. And then there are many, many fewer counties that that are lopsidedly Democratic, and those that are focused on the major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and a number of others. So that here we see very clearly, first of all, growing polarization. Most people live in places that are lopsidedly Republican or lopsidedly Democratic. Only a minority of Americans at this point lived in counties which were competitive. Notice Iowa happens to be one of the states with probably the most competitive counties. And secondly, that you see the urban-rural division becoming much stronger. And you notice that whereas in 1976 the South was heavily Democratic, that there are only a very few counties in the South by 2004 that were Democratic. Most of them were Republican, lopsidedly Republican. This shows fast forwarding to 2016. Now we see it's even more extreme. It's just a sea of red, even though the Hillary Clinton won the popular vote nationally by 3 million votes. Nevertheless, if you just look at geography, there's far more counties that were lopsidedly Republican than for Clinton. This, by the way, isn't focused on landslides. It's just showing who won 50% or more. So the Democrats have some strength in on the West Coast and in the Northeast, and and then pockets here and there in other states, mostly in major urban areas, and most of rural America is voted for Trump. We can see that even more clearly in this graph. It divides up. It looks at urban cores, suburbs, medium-sized cities, small cities, very small cities, rural. Well, it doesn't take a lot of complexity here. Urban cores were heavily Democratic. Everything else was lopsidedly Republican, especially rural areas. But even suburbs, medium-sized cities were substantially Republican. So a very small number of urban areas that have a far disproportionate number of people compared to the rest of the country were Democratic, and then less dense parts of the country were Republican. This is another way of looking at the urban-rural divide by partisanship. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won only 472 counties compared to almost 2,600 for Donald Trump. That would seem to suggest that Donald Trump would have had a runaway election, but in fact, Hillary's 472 amounted to more popular votes than Trump's 2,600 counties. And then if you look at the share of GDP, you notice that the counties that voted for Hillary Clinton, again mostly urban areas, accounted for almost 2/3 of the national economy. And now Al Gore, in 2000, he also won many fewer counties than George W. Bush, although more than Hillary Clinton. But those counties accounted for a little over half of GDP rather than close to 2/3. So you see the Democratic vote is narrowing in on a smaller number of counties, but counties that have an even greater weight in the economy. This, by the way, shows us we can do the same kind of analysis at the local level. This is Marshalltown, Iowa. There's a small, heavily Democratic, probably the downtown of Marshalltown. And then you can see the further away you get from downtown, the less Democratic, and then finally the more Republican. And so that Democratic core of Marshalltown is surrounded by a sea of red in the rural areas. Now we can look again here, and just another way of breaking out this kind of finding, that this looks at the House votes for House of Representatives in 2018 by district, and pure rural districts went overwhelmingly for the Republicans. Pure urban districts went actually entirely for the Democrats. There were no pure urban districts that went for the Republicans. And urban-suburban mix were overwhelmingly Democratic. So again, where you live determines to a great extent whether you're Republican or Democrat. And most people live in places where there's very little party competition. One party dominates. And people have, and this is true in part because people have chosen, they've got up and moved around to live in places where they feel more comfortable with the politics of their neighbors. Now, this is not just limited to the United States. So let's look at England, Wales, and on the one hand, and then France on the other. On the left side, you see the vote to leave the European Union in England and Wales, and you notice that the blue, which is the Remain vote, and those um, counties, a majority voted to stay in the European Union. It's a small number of counties, but if we were able to identify cities, we'd notice that that's strongly urban areas and also wealthier areas in England and Wales, whereas the majority of counties in low density and probably less lower income per capita, those went heavily for Brexit. And then in 2017, the vote for the French presidential election, the first round vote, Macron was the kind of centrist candidate, and Le Pen the far right anti-immigrant candidate. And you can see here that again the majority um, of the counties were won by Le Pen, but Macron ended up winning the election because he was more successful in a smaller number but highly populated counties. Now, we also can look at how urban rural areas are defined according to race. So, in rural areas, 79% of the population is white. Um, in suburban areas, 68% white. Urban areas, only 44% white. So, that's because of two factors. One is that there was, in the post-World War II period, a large immigration of blacks from rural areas in the South to urban areas in the North in search of manufacturing jobs. And secondly, there have that new immigrants to the United States, and we know that immigration in the last 30 years has risen substantially. Those new immigrants generally gravitate toward large cities, and so relatively few end up in rural areas. And so the proportion of whites in urban areas is therefore smaller. Now we can even sort by personality type. There was a survey which tried to measure the degree of openness, the tendency to be open to new aesthetic, cultural, or intellectual experiences versus being more closed to those kinds of things. And you can see here that there's considerable variation in the degree of openness by population. Iowa happens to be toward the closed end of the scale, as do most of the Midwest and parts of the plains. The West Coast, Northeast are more open. There are some surprises here. Georgia, Tennessee, Texas are more toward the open end of the scale. But there are differences. If we look here at London, we see on the left a population density map. So the areas that are orange or yellow or red have the highest population densities per square mile. Those that are blue or greenish have lower population density. And so you see that the most populous areas, not surprisingly, are in the center of the city, and those toward the least populous toward the periphery. Well, if you look at a map showing openness to new experiences, well, it almost perfectly matches level of population density. So I think there's two things going on here. One is that people who are more open to new experiences, to different cultures, gravitate toward being in areas where they are regularly confronted with difference culturally, racially, ethnically, religiously, etc. They're comfortable in those environments and tend to prefer them. Those who, on the other hand, are prefer to live in surroundings that are more homogenous and are less open to new experiences, they tend to gravitate to more rural areas that feature those characteristics. The second is that I think that simply we have some other research that shows us that being exposed to difference actually reduces people's sense of fearfulness of difference and tends to reduce stereotypes that might lead people to be less open. So even if you're not open to start with, if you are exposed to difference because you live in a place that has a lot of diversity, then you tend to be more tolerant than people who've never been exposed to diversity. And of course, that's more likely in urban centers. Now we can also sort by education, geography by education. This shows what we've seen in other data I presented in other lectures, but you can see here on the left side all voters that by 2016, Democrats did much better among college graduates than they did among those who had never had only some college or less. But if we look at if we focus particularly on white voters, we can see that the differences are even starker. That in 2016, those who had a college education or more, that's the darker line and the darker dotted line, were much more likely to vote Democratic than those who had less education among whites. So education is particularly powerful in predicting partisanship among whites. So how do we sum up all of this? Well, the urban versus rural differentiation is very important in American politics. It's become, in some ways, a dominant motif because it is associated with a bunch of other factors that now have begun to cluster together by geographically. So compared with urban areas, the big sort has left rural areas, first of all, with fewer people, especially as a proportion of the population. The rural areas are less diverse, more homogeneous, less educated population, less open and tolerant, as people who are more comfortable with diversity, who have better educations, are moving out of the rural areas, which are economically deprived, to the cities. They also, rural areas are more Republican. It doesn't say here, but more white, and less economically vital, which we'll get into more in the second part of this two-part lecture series, and also more socially distressed. So this gives us an interesting look into how our politics is affected by geography and differences in how people sort out according to education and income and race and other factors. Well, I'll stop here, and when you are ready, you can move on to the second part of this lecture.